Hello and welcome. I am Kate Clark LeMay, and I use pronouns she, her. I am the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery's scholarly center. Thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation, Native American Women and the Politics of Portraiture at the Turn of the 20th Century. Presented by Kathleen D. Cahill, Associate Professor of History at Penn State University, and followed by a Q&A moderated by my wonderful Smithsonian colleague, Cecile R. Gonton, a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian. Although we are tuning in together today from very different places, as we just saw through the chat, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We are so pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. We welcome our viewers to this conversation series, and like I said, you were zooming in from all over the world, and we're so pleased. Please note that this Zoom is being recorded and it will be available to view on the National Portrait Gallery's YouTube channel under the Portal header. You will find, like I said, that the chat has been enabled so that you can compare notes about the lecture in real time. However, please use the Q&A feature to submit a question for the formal Q&A that will follow the conversation. And I have sad news. We would like to take a moment to recognize and honor Daniel B. Greenberg, the generous philanthropist whose support, along with that of his partner, Susan Steinhauser, has made the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture possible. Sadly, Dan passed away last week, but his passion for scholarship and supporting research, emerging art historians, and the arts overall will never be forgotten. Dan's involvement with the National Portrait Gallery began with his support of the official portrait of President William J. Clinton, commissioned for our collection. In his spirit of supporting museum collections, Dan also purchased photographs of Leonard Bernstein and Edward Steichen by Henri Cartier-Bresson for our collection. Most recently, Dan and Susan Steinhauser made a 5-year commitment to underwrite the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. And we're so grateful because this forum has touched the lives of many aspiring and career scholars, curators, and historians. And indeed, it has inspired new thinking and is expanding scholarship around portraiture. Dan's passing is a loss to the world, but we will continue his vision with the subsequent programs in the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. Now, please allow me to introduce tonight's presenter, Kathleen D. Cahill. Dr. Cahill earned her PhD at the University of Chicago. She taught at the University of New Mexico for 13 years before moving to Penn State, where she is now an associate professor of history. She is the author of Recasting the Vote: How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2020. Her first book, Federal Fathers and Mothers: A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, was published in 2011 And it won the Labriola Center for American Indian National Book Award. And it was a finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clements Book Prize. This year, she co-edited a special suffrage issue for the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era with Kimberly Hamlin and Crystal Feinster. She's also the steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History. I'm delighted she is here, and I now turn today's presentation over to Dr. Cahill.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate. I am extremely honored to be here, and I'm very sorry to hear about Dan Greenberg's passing. I'm grateful to both he and Mrs. Steinhauser for their contributions, and I'm really honored to be part of this today. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share, I think. Yes, I do want to continue. Here we are. Okay, so as you heard, I'm joining you from central Pennsylvania today, which is the traditional homeland of the Susquehannock people. And as I said, I'm honored to be here, and I'm so grateful that you're choosing to share part of your afternoon with me. Before I get started, I want to just say that some of the images and some of the language on the images that I'll be showing today are from the past, when racial slurs and stereotypes were often quite casually used in public. I'm going to be talking about those things critically, but you will see some of them and hear some of them, so I just want to let you know before I begin the show. So, here we go. For Native women, clothing is an important symbol of their ongoing cultural traditions. As you can see from these recent headlines, it continues to be politically important, and there's a long history behind this. Today, I'm going to take us back 100 years and talk about two nationally known Native activists, Bottineau Baldwin, a woman of Turtle Mountain Chippewa and French heritage, and Gertrude Bonnin, also known as Zitkala-Ša, a Yankton Dakota woman. And I'm going to discuss particularly the ways they very strategically used their style choices to enter national conversations and make political assertions. And if you'll watch carefully, you'll see from the slides that most of the images I'm using come either from Smithsonian collections or from the Library of Congress. The others are all from newspapers at the time. And some of my slides will be blank. So there'll be a couple of blank ones like the next one. So before I talk about Baldwin and Bonnin, I'm going to give you some very quick background, kind of the bigger context of the moment. And it's quite complex, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about it in the Q&A. But in essence, Native nations are sovereign nations that existed on the continent before the American Revolution. The federal government continued to acknowledge this sovereignty by making treaties with them. And treaties, of course, are agreements bound by international law. But that changed after the Civil War. In 1871, as the US Army was fighting against many of those nations and forcing them onto reservations, the federal government ended diplomatic relations with Native governments. And instead, it began to treat individual Native people as the legal wards of the government. So that's the category, legal wards. And those wards were seen as not yet fit for full US citizenship. To make these supposed uncivilized Native Americans fit for citizenship, the federal government created what became known as a policy of assimilation. This was a complex policy designed to destroy indigenous communities and polities and to assimilate or incorporate Native people into the nation as individual citizens, indistinguishable from other citizens. And this was built on three broad aspects. First, the breaking up of tribally held and treaty guaranteed land. Second, the development of a series of boarding schools to remove Native children from their communities. And third, a number of laws outlawing cultural practices. So essentially, the government was dividing reservation land into individual farmsteads, sending children away to boarding schools to learn how to farm and raise families there, and then instituting laws that made Native cultural practices anything from men wearing their hair long to practicing religions illegal. And the plan was, once this had all sort of happened and Native people had been civilized, policymakers would grant US citizenship. And I need to add that while the federal government stopped recognizing Native nations and Native governments, Native people didn't. Right? Now, as you can see from this photo, looking a certain way and wearing certain clothing was part of the process of becoming civilized. And this strategy of before and after photos, and this is the same woman in both photos, this kind of photo was pioneered by General Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the government's first off-reservation boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879. Pratt famously described the mission of the boarding schools as to, quote, kill the Indian in him to save the man, end quote. And these photos are a very powerful public relations tool, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. And you can see that the photo on the left, Wahatsihari, was the before photo. And once she had gone through the schools and the assimilation process, the photo on the right was the after, right? The desired outcome. And you can see she's wearing a modern wedding dress. Her hair is up in sort of fashionable sense, and she's getting married to a Native man who also is wearing particular kind of clothing with short hair. And this PR was successful, and the government eventually opens a number of boarding schools, over 20 off-reservation schools, and many more that were on-reservation boarding schools. And the curriculum in those schools reinforced this change in dress. And girls in particular were taught to sew and launder appropriate clothing and to raise their children to wear that kind of clothing as well. So images and the clothing in which people were wearing in those images could be used to gauge progress towards civilization for Native women. Ooh, excuse me. At the same time, many white Americans believed that real Indians looked like the woman on the left, right, or the picture on the left. They looked a certain way, and this was reinforced through popular culture. Wild West shows, world fairs, dime novels, and later motion pictures presented Native people this way, right? In buckskin, with feathers and blankets, often looking like the cultures from the Great Plains. And there was a sense that this cultural tradition, and Native peoples were disappearing. And let me just add that for Native women, there were sort of two main stereotypes, kind of a dichotomy that people tended to think about when they thought about Native women. And scholars have talked about this as the princess and the, quote, squaw drudge. The princess was a noble woman who often kind of would die by the end of the story, again, was disappearing, while the squaw drudge was a downtrodden woman whose husband forces her to do all the work while he lazily sits around. And neither of those were, represented real people, but were these kind of categories of stereotype. So as I said, Native people were legally considered wards of the government. Now, other categories of wards included children, the mentally ill, or prisoners. As a ward, you have no ability to make your own decisions. Your guardian makes those decisions, including political decisions like voting. White suffragists at the same time often complained that they were classed in this category and they didn't deserve to be. So you can see here, this painting was commissioned by Henrietta Briggs Wall, who was a Kansas suffragist for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The title, American Woman and Her Political Peers, makes clear the argument, which is a which one of these is not like the others argument. The white woman in the center is a real woman. It's Frances Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and you see her white ribbon on her chest. This was the biggest women's organization in the nation and in the world at the time. And Briggs said she chose Willard because she represented, quote, all the womanhood of this land with her sweet, serene, lovely, and intellectual face, end quote. Now, the men around her represent different types, all of whom are wards at the time, right? So from the bottom left, you have the native man, upper left is an idiot, a prisoner, and then the bottom is a lunatic, right? And this is a really good example of how white suffragists were using visual images to make their arguments. And here I'm drawing on the excellent work of Alison Lang. And Lang argues that in order to counter stereotypes of suffragists as masculine and unattractive, they emphasized beauty in their images. And at this time in mainstream culture, beauty means white women. And there's a real explosion in this kind of pro-suffrage imagery at the turn of the century. And you can see just a few examples here. The proliferation of these images implied that all suffragists were white middle-class women. And women of color were often invisible in these images, though sometimes men of color were pictured. But I'll mention one exception to women of color below. So, blank screen. So Native women who wanted to engage in political conversations, especially around suffrage, had to navigate all of these different ideas. And they faced some dilemmas. So first, many of them saw value in the traditional cultures and art forms that the government was trying to erase. And they often wanted to celebrate those traditions. But if they looked too authentically Indian, then they might be seen as uncivilized and not worthy of being listened to. At the same time, if they didn't look Indian enough, then their white audience might not recognize that they were Native. And finally, as we saw, white suffragists were creating images that really centered white women as suffragists, as political actors, and so it's hard to imagine other women in that role. So what I'm going to show you today is that Native women at the turn of the century came up with creative strategies by embracing photography to navigate those dilemmas. And again, I'll look at two activists, Bottineau Baldwin and Gertrude Bonnin, to make my case. So Bottineau Baldwin and Bonnin, and I'm sorry, their names both start with B, shared a number of things in common. Both were highly educated in Western traditions, though neither of them attended federal Indian schools. Bottineau Baldwin graduated from a Catholic school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and then spent time at the St. John's Ladies' College in Winnipeg, Canada. Gertrude Bonnin went to a Quaker mission school in Indiana when she was 8 years old, and later graduated from Earlham College, also in Indiana. Both women then worked for the federal government as employees of the Indian Service, and both were active members and officers in the Society of American Indians. The SAI was an organization very similar to the NAACP. It was founded in 1911, again, around the same time. And members of the SAI advocated for US citizenship for Native people as a way to give them political voice, which they then hoped to use to advocate for tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. And I'll just say that not all Native people wanted US citizenship, and so that's important to remember. So the members of the Society of American Indians also practiced what scholars of African American history have called respectability politics. They encouraged members to present themselves as modern to kind of counter these stereotypes. One of the officers, Arthur C. Parker, a Seneca man, wrote that they were, quote, proud of the ability of the race to advance as they were. Their clothing was that of the citizenship of the great nation. There were no blankets, no feathers, no relics of the past. For these men and women were the Indians of today, pleading for the future, end quote. And you can see this cartoon, it's from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which was the site of their national conference in 1916. And there's, again, from the title, the expectation is based on these stereotypes, but the reality, and this is exactly the message that the SAI members wanted to project, was that Native people were modern and had a future in the US as citizens. And certainly the Native women that I'm discussing today practice this kind of politics to an extent. Okay? So here's Bottineau Baldwin. As I said, she's a member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation, and she also was of French descent. Turtle Mountain Chippewa's reservation is in what is now the state of North Dakota. She moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1890s with her father, who was an attorney, and he was sent by tribal leaders to contest a treaty that the nation had signed with the United States. And she goes with him to Washington to work as his legal clerk. She later begins to clerk for the Office of Indian Affairs, also in the Washington, D.C. office. And I need to point out that at that time, the Office of Indian Affairs was housed in the Patent Office, which is currently where the National Portrait Gallery resides. So if we had been there today for this talk, you could imagine Marie Baldwin walking those halls. And you can see that on the left-hand side, that's her father's stationery from when he was living in Washington and working for the nation. In Washington, Marie gets involved even further involved, I should say, in politics because of two experiences. First, she enrolled in the Washington College of Law. The Washington College of Law, which is now American University's law school, was a feminist law school founded by women to train women because most law schools in the nation refused to let them take classes. Though in Washington, D.C., Howard University, the historically Black college, did allow women to enroll. So it's at the Washington College of Law that, as you might imagine, was a hotbed of feminism, that Marie Baldwin becomes very involved in the suffrage movement. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that she helps to found and becomes the treasurer of the Society of American Indians. And the first headquarters for the Society of American Indians was just 1 block away from the pension office, or the Bureau, which was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was in the Barrister Building at 6th and F Street. So as I said, the SAI fought back against these stereotypes of Native people, and the women in the SAI particularly pushed back against the stereotypes of Native women. So Marie Baldwin, for example, called for an appreciation of Native women's art forms. And along with the other women, she fought against demeaning stereotypes, and especially the derogatory word squaw with its sexualized overtones. And in 1914, they wrote an article in the journal, the Society's journal, explicitly saying this was a horrible word and people shouldn't use it. They also asserted that despite what federal policy suggested, Native women were treated better in their traditional cultures than white women in mainstream US culture. They pointed especially to the matriarchal power of many nations and noted that, again, in many cultures, Native women had more say in political decisions, that they were able to own property, they had rights to their children, and could get a divorce, all things that were very difficult for white women to do at this time. And you can see that the women of the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee were especially kind of held up. And white suffragists were really intrigued by this idea, as you can see from this cartoon. But what's also implied in this image is that those Native women are in the past, and that's being signaled by the cartoonist, who's not Native, through what they're wearing. They're also sort of watching modern women who are represented as suffragists march by into the future. And the title itself, even as it's questioning civilization, is certainly suggesting a progression in which Native women will be left behind. So in 1913, suffragists in Washington, D.C. were planning a parade for the same weekend as Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this was a parade where they were going to announce that they were going to fight for a constitutional amendment that would enfranchise women. So this is Alice Paul is planning this parade. The women of the Washington College of Law were very involved in the planning, and Marie Baldwin is asked to create a float celebrating Native women's traditional matriarchal power. And on the left-hand side, there's a newspaper article about this float, and you can see how she's portrayed here, right? She's wearing braids, she has a shawl or a blanket around her shoulder. This is the expected Indian look, right? She looks like those before photos. But she ultimately said no to creating a float, and instead she chose to march with the lawyers from the Washington College of Law, who all wore caps and gowns. So she probably looked like she does here on the right-hand side. And this is a good example of how she mobilized her image. She knew what white people expected Native women to look like, and in fact sat for photos leaning into that expectation. She did this at least twice. So one example here on the left, you can see this is the photograph that she distributed to newspapers beginning at least in 1911. And here's the actual photograph. The fact that her braids seem to be hastily done and they're not tied off, they're not very tight, suggests to me that this is posed. And in her original, she chose a background that emphasized beadwork, right? And particularly Chippewa or Ojibwe beadwork, as well, not only the blankets, but the cuffs on her wrists demonstrate this. And again, she was probably asked by reporters for an image to go along with their articles. And in including the beadwork, she was highlighting Native women's artistic work, something that, as I said, she championed. But you can see on the left how newspapers edited that out, right? So it's not in the background there. Now, Baldwin very clearly understood that she was intervening in national conversations about Native women's representations. So the first time that I found this picture, which is in 1911, she was being interviewed by a reporter about her early life in North Dakota and Minnesota. And according to the reporter, she, quote, protested against the headdress so often shown on Indian women in pictures and paintings displayed in the East. She said that few Indian women wear any of the gaudy feathers and beads shown in the pictures, end quote. And her portraits, and you'll see a second one in a minute, are more demure, shall we say, where she's wearing she has the braids and is wearing the shawl, but it's not as gaudy as some of the stereotypical images were. So in 1914, she sat for a similar portrait. And this one seems to be a little more complex. This series of photographs is found in the Smithsonian's American Anthropological Archives and was taken by Lancey W. Gill, who was a photographer for the Bureau of American Ethnology. Gill worked for the Bureau for 4 decades, from the 1890s through the 1930s. And during that time, he took some 2,000 to 3,000 photographs of Native peoples, more than all his predecessors combined, according to one internal history. Most of those photographs were of visiting delegations from Native nations who visited Washington, D.C. And the poses here that Marie Baldwin is sitting in are pretty standard anthropological poses from the time. Anthropology was trying to categorize the people of the nation, people of the world, using phrenology, or the shapes of their heads and their profiles. Now, Joe Jeniton Palawa, who's a historian at George Mason, has written about the long history of portraiture of visiting delegates who were visiting Washington, D.C., first paintings and then photographs. And the federal government, which commissioned these portraits, displayed them in federal buildings and museums. And the images gave white Americans a catalog of these supposedly disappearing cultures. But Jeniton Palawa argues that while it served one purpose for white Americans, many Native people who came to DC would then visit the portraits when they were there to see their ancestors who'd come to the Capitol before them. So these photographs in the archives are labeled as being portraits from a delegation. And certainly in the 1890s, Bottineau Baldwin may have been present when the Turtle Mountain Chippewa delegations visited the Bureau of Ethnology and sat for portraits. But I don't think that's what she was doing here in 1914. And the mystery deepens a little bit when we see this photo on the right, which was also part of the series. So the man with her is J.N.B. Hewitt, who was an employee of the Bureau of Ethnology. Like Baldwin, he was of mixed European and indigenous descent. He was Scottish and Tuscarora. And he worked at the Bureau as a linguist. He wrote several dictionaries of Native languages. He was a good friend of Marie's and her father's. And in fact, she and Hewitt wrote her father's obituary when he died in 1911. All 3 of them were also members of Washington's Anthropological Society, along with Francis LaFleche, who was an Omaha man who also worked at the Bureau with Marie Bottineau Baldwin. And we have to remember that at the time, Native history was relegated to anthropology. So anyone interested in Native history, as these four people were, had to go through anthropology to talk about it. So they're all quite familiar with the Bureau of Ethnology and with these anthropological ideas, and they're all very invested in Native history. So again, here she seems to be posing again in an Indian outfit. Her hair looks like it was quickly unpinned, and the shawl or blanket is wrapped around her shoulders. But you can see, especially on the left-hand side, that she's underneath that is wearing a modern dress, and you can see the rings on her left hand. So I haven't seen this image in newspapers. So perhaps she and Hewitt were merely playing with this form of the before and after photo. They both, again, were very familiar with it. And they left us with this mystery in the nation's anthropological archives. But for Marie Bottineau Baldwin, what's useful about these photographs of herself in braids with a shawl is that they got her attention. And that attention got her interviews and invitations to speak to different audiences. And when she talked, people listened. And in her talks, she tended to undermine their expectations about Native women. So this is a great example of that. And you see kind of many of the things I'm talking about coming together in this one image. From the headline, you can see that her interview is celebrating Native cultures and the place of women in them, and implicitly criticizing white culture in which most white women do not have the right to vote. Also, you see that she gave the reporter all three of her photographs, and by printing them all, they emphasize her ability to embrace tradition and modernity as symbolized through her dress. And she used her image in other ways as well. As I mentioned, she's in Washington for Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And during his administration, the civil service began to require employees to submit pictures into their personnel files, or if they were applying for the first time. And this was part of the Wilson administration's efforts to segregate the civil service, and especially to keep African Americans from getting positions. So this photograph is the one that Marie Baldwin submitted to her file. And here I argue that she's using the opposite strategy than that she used during the suffrage parade. As we know, she had pictures of herself in sort of turn of the century Victorian finery that she could have used. So this was a deliberate choice. It was rejecting the very goal of her own employer, which was the erasure of Native culture. And instead, it celebrates Native women's artistic skills. You can see her right this time, it's not in the background, it's actually right part of what she's wearing. She's wearing the shawl with the beaded front of her dress and the beautiful dentelia earrings on her ears. And indeed, she was actually quite a collector of Native women's art, celebrating again those same uncivilized skills that the government was trying to stamp out. And here's a photo of her from 1927 with her art collection. And that year, it actually is put on display in the Department of the Interior. So there's a bit of a shift there by the late 1920s. Now, a number of Native women used this strategy. Marie Bottineau Baldwin's colleague in the Society of American Indians, Gertrude Bonnin, for example, called her buckskin dress her, quote, calling card. She knew that it opened doors for her, but once she got on stage, instead of talking about the past, disappearing traditions, etc., she talked to her audience about what she called, quote, the Indians of today, and emphasized the problems that they faced, including their lack of political power, land loss, and healthcare. Now, Bonnin learned this power of photography fairly early. As a young woman who had just graduated from Earlham College and soon to take up a position in the federal boarding school at Carlisle, She was photographed by the photographer Gertrude Kasebier in 1898. Kasebier, whom Ladies' Home Journal would describe in 1901 as one of, quote, the foremost women photographers in America, photographed Bonnin in her studio on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And as you can see, her photographs were donated to the Smithsonian by her granddaughter, Mina Turner, in 1969. Kasebier was known for two kinds of portraits: photographs of society women and photographs of Native people, especially the Native men who worked for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And she would photograph them when they were in town performing at Madison Square Garden. And with her series of photographs of Gertrude Bonnin, she kind of put these two things together. So as you can see in this set, Kasebier took a number of photographs that highlighted Bonnin's proficiency with the violin in front of this fancy flowered wallpaper and in Western style dress, though her hair is kind of more bohemian, right? It's down and loose. But in this next set of pictures, she's very clearly in Indian dress. And scholars have noted that her pose on the left, where she's looking into the distance and shading her eyes with her hand, was very much signaling Indianness as well. So again, these are these kinds of before and after photographs. And it's this after or Indian photograph that Kasebier published. The picture on the right, she used to illustrate her article from 1901, When the Sioux Chiefs Party Calls, which appeared in Everybody's Magazine. And it was this picture of Bonnin, as well as pictures of the Native men from Buffalo Bill's show. Now, one of the photographs from this photo shoot is slightly different from these two sets. It's somewhat in between. Here you can see Bonnin in the white dress in front of the wallpaper, but, and I apologize for the quality of this image, there are beads woven into the back of her hair and she's holding a basket. And in many ways, this reveals her own insistence on being able to embrace both modernity and her Native heritage. And whether this photo was her idea or Kasebier's, it's quite striking. So as I said, these photos were taken right before she started her teaching at Carlisle Indian School, where she only taught for a very short period of time before becoming quite frustrated by working and having to teach sort of federal assimilation policies. She left Carlisle and moved to Boston to study piano and violin at the Boston Music Conservatory. And it's around this time that she began to write her short stories under the name Zitkala-Sa that brought her to national attention. And she tended to write about her experiences in school, and her writings were quite critical of federal assimilation policy and the sort of emotional impact it had on Native children and families. She also went to France to perform at the Paris Exposition, to play violin. So all of these experiences together taught her a great deal about staging, performance, and presentation, which she would then use as she became a political activist. So like Marie Bottineau Baldwin, she began to distribute photographs to the press to use with their stories. And so let me start with this photo. In March of 1917, she had married, and she and her husband kind of rejoined the Indian service and were stationed in Utah. And she took a vacation and went to Southern California, where she likely took this picture at the Hartsook studio. You see the name of the studio on the photograph. Hartsook was a California chain of photography studios. It's possible that this dress came from a performance of the Sundance Opera, which was an opera that she wrote celebrating the Plains Sioux tradition of the Sundance. And it was performed in Utah in 1913. But so she takes the picture in 1917 in California. By June of that year, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she took up the position as secretary of the Society of American Indians. And secretary was the position that really ran the organization. President was sort of a pretty titular role. So in December of 1917, she participated in the National Women's Christian Temperance Union convention, which took place in Washington. The press described her as wearing, quote, a full Indian costume, and she was also described as, quote, vying with Miss Rankin as the center of attention, end quote, at the conference. Miss Rankin, of course, was the newly elected congresswoman from Montana, the first woman ever elected to Congress. And as I said, Bonnin came to call this dress her calling card, knowing that it opened doors and created opportunities for her. A few months later, her photo began to appear in newspapers. Sometimes it was this photo, sometimes it was just a headshot. And this publicity really made her a much more familiar name in Washington, and she began to receive multiple requests to speak to organizations, including suffrage groups. So as you know, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and it stated that women shall, the vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex. But that left it open for other ways in which it could be denied. And Native women in particular, as wards of the government, were unable to vote. And so after the ratification, Gertrude Bonnin and other Native women continued to insist that Native women deserved citizenship and that they did not need to abandon their Native traditions and identities in order to have it. In a pamphlet that reprinted a speech from this period that she gave called Americanize the First American, she used a headshot of herself wearing this dress, but surrounded it with small American flags. And her advocacy was ultimately successful in that Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to all Native people, whether or not they wanted it. But despite that, and I don't have time to go into it here, but again, I'm willing to discuss it in the Q&A, Native people had to continue to fight to be able to exercise their right to vote and other civil rights throughout the 20th century. So even Bonnin continues her activism. And as she got older, she indicated that traveling with and wearing this outfit was quite difficult. When a woman from Franklin and Marshall Academy in Lancaster, Pennsylvania invited her to speak, she wrote, quote, "At your request, I am bringing my Indian costume for the occasion. It is so heavy to carry on and off the trains that of late I have left it unless it was clearly understood that I would not have to carry it about by myself." So the women that I've discussed today were quite adept at using clothing to open doors, to send messages, and to undermine stereotypes about Native people. Their photographs remain in our archives, but it's important to put them into context because it wasn't just about the image, it was also about the words that they spoke. Their defense of Native people's lands, traditions, and sovereignty. Their insistence that federal treaty rights needed to be upheld, and their demonstration that they could maintain their cultural identities and be modern American citizens. And I just want to conclude by bringing us back to the present and to highlight how their legacy and these continued strategies are still used by Native women in the present. So this is, of course, an image of New Mexico Representative Deb Haaland, who's a member of the Laguna Pueblo people. And she is one of the first two Native women who were elected to Congress. She and Sharice Davids, who's a Ho-Chunk woman and representative from Kansas, were both elected in 2018. And as you most likely know, Haaland, was recently nominated for Secretary of the Interior by Joe Biden and just went through confirmation hearings, though the vote has not yet happened. This is a billboard that went up in Montana to support her nomination. And there are two things I want to point out. First, that the text, the first people of this land, the last to receive the vote, very much echoes Gertrude Bonnin's Americanize the First American. And we also see an echo of the Native suffragists from the turn of the century in Haaland's strategy of continuing to use traditional Pueblo clothing and jewelry to signify ongoing cultural traditions. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was amazing. And I think just judging by the chat box, all of our listeners are really, really impressed and enthusiastic about what they're learning. I want to take this minute right now to introduce my colleague, Cecile Gonton, who will moderate the Q&A portion of tonight's program. Born in New York City, Cecile Gonton joined the National Museum of the American Indians curatorial staff in 1990. She is the curator, most recently, of Developing Stories, Native Photographers in the Field, a series of photo essay exhibitions created by Native photojournalists working in collaboration with the NMAI. She is also the curator of the NMAI DC's ongoing exhibition, Americans, and author of that exhibition's companion book, Officially Indian: Symbols That Define the United States. In addition, she is the curator of an exhibition on view in Lower Manhattan at the NMAI in New York, and it's called An Affinity of Nations, Art and History, in the collections of the National Museum of the American Indian. And she is the editor of the companion publication to that exhibition, which earned her the Secretary of the Smithsonian's Excellence in Research Award in 2011 for her work on that book. Ms. Gonton, she earned her BA degree in art history and an MA degree in anthropology from New York University in 1979 and 1994, respectively. So now please welcome Cecile, and I'm going to turn my camera off so that you two can start talking. And as they do, I would just like to invite our audience to please fill your questions into the Q&A chat. Thank you. And Cecile and Kathleen, you should unmute yourselves.
Okay. Kate, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I do want to start by saying what a pleasure and honor it is for me to be here with you and Kathleen this evening. Kathleen, that was a fascinating talk, and you've provided us with a lot of food for thought. To get our Q&A started, I'd like to suggest that perhaps the forerunner of these photographic portraits that you've been showing this evening, perhaps they might be said to be the hundreds and thousands of carte de visite and stereograph images that territorial photographers made of Native peoples in the late 19th century. Now, the Native peoples in those photographs were not in control of how they were being photographed, and certainly not how their images were being used. But in the early 20th century, with the photographs that you've been showing us, the photographers were on an equal footing with the photographers, and in many cases may have even hired them. So women like Bonnin, Native activists like Bonnin and Baldwin, not only had agency, but they were savvy about the visual presentation of themselves to the external world, and they controlled to a great degree how their images were being used. Would you argue that there was essentially no precedent for how Native women like Baldwin and Bonnin were able to exploit photography, a Western medium, and portraiture for their own benefit?
That's a really good question. Thank you. And let me just say I'm honored to be having this conversation with you. I think that's, in terms of photography, I would say yes, though certainly, right, in other art forms, they were expressing themselves, but photography, absolutely, until the turn of the century, right, was an expensive procedure, required a lot of technical skill and very large cameras, but it becomes more democratized. And so that's part of what the suffragists were doing more broadly, was using, that's why there's this proliferation of images. But precisely, Native women and we see women from other groups, African American women in particular, using access to studios and a less expensive access to photography to be able to sit for those portraits, right, and really determine what they're wearing, what's in the background and around them. And so, yeah, I think that this is the initial moment where they're able to control that, and again, distribute it to the newspapers, right? They're the ones doing that.
So in the early 20th century, the 20s in particular, saw a wave of modern advancements throughout the country. The introduction of the airplane, motion picture technology, refrigerators, telephones, radios, and nationwide, these advancements transformed Americans' everyday lives. They also coincided with a rise in wages, but this prosperity never reached most American Indian reservations, and to the contrary, Native peoples living on reservations were economically marginalized. So how do you think Bonnin's and Baldwin's presentation of self in portraiture really allowed them to make their arguments, not only on women's rights, but against ill-conceived assimilation policies that they themselves were a product of? I'm thinking here, for example, of Baldwin's official Office of the American Indian Portrait. And I'm thinking it was quite subversive and perhaps even radical. And I'm wondering if we might consider it akin to athletes today taking the knee during the singing of the national anthem to protest police violence and racism. Is that taking this too far, or do you recognize some sort of affinity between these acts?
That's interesting. I will say that when I found that picture in her personnel file, it struck me, right? It's a beautiful picture, first of all. And exactly, it's very different from the other pictures that other people were including. And you can see, again, it's the first time the government has done this. So people are just kind of sending in, whatever they have. But I know she had that other portrait, right? I know she had options. And so I know she deliberately made that choice. And again, to put it in her file for the Bureau of Indian Affairs strikes me as absolutely subversive and standing on the point, right, and making the statement. So it is political and it is subversive. I also, though, have to acknowledge that she is doing something else that I didn't talk about in this talk, but I talk about in my book, which is at the same moment, she's also very deliberately distancing herself from African Americans in the civil service and making a claim to not being white, right, but not being Black. And the context of that is, again, the Wilson administration is segregating the spaces of these federal buildings, right, putting up curtains between Black and white employees, making Black employees use different bathrooms, right, colored bathrooms or colored cafeterias. And she clearly doesn't want to be grouped in with non-whites, right? So she's doing something a little more complicated. So I don't necessarily, and she writes a letter about an African-American employee of the Indian Service and tries to get him fired. And I think that's all part of what she's doing. So I'm hesitant to compare it exactly to people taking a knee, but she is very much navigating these really complex racial politics in the nation's capital. And the other thing I would add is that I don't think it's a coincidence that these women who are engaging in these national conversations both live in Washington, D.C., right? Both live in the nation's capital and visit reservations, right? And sometimes live on reservations, but are also living in urban areas and are therefore having kind of conversations across, with a lot of white Americans and trying to navigate that as well.
Kathleen, I think we have a great follow-up question from our audience. The question is there evidence that public attitudes towards Native American women changed as women began to control and orchestrate the photos taken of them?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they're successful to a certain extent. I think the whole narrative among suffragists about how Native cultures are matriarchal and that kind of positive understanding of them, it's not right a deep understanding, but that comes from Native people themselves, and including the women that I was talking about. Also, particularly Gertrude Bonnin's activism after 1920, she works very closely with the General Federation of Women's Clubs. They hire her, she's a speaker and speaks throughout the nation to their organization. And I think that her advocacy and emphasis on, she's calling for them to support citizenship for Native people. I think that plays into the Indian Citizenship Act and then the later New Deal policies. So I do think that they are successful. At the same time, though, it is, it's a fine line, because those images of themselves, as Indians also play into a stereotype. So if people just see the images, they might bring those ideas to them. So, they're pushing back against, there's a lot of imagery of Native people out there that they are kind of really trying to change. So I do think they're successful, but perhaps not as much as they would have liked to have been.
Kathleen, we have a few people who would like to know the name of your new book. So will you please tell them that? And I would like to say I highly recommend it.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. So it's called Recasting the Vote. And the University of North Carolina Press has published it. It's on their webpage. It is available on all online retailers as well. So Recasting the Vote, and thank you for asking.
We do have a question which you sort of addressed, but it's a question that would come to many people's minds. So I think maybe I'll just read it to you. How much interaction was there at this time between Native Americans and African Americans who were fighting for voting rights and respect? Was there support among them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't see a lot of support among them. So let me step back and say, so there are, some Native nations where there are people of African descent who are members. But in this sort of, what I'm talking about are Native women and African American women who also live in Washington, D.C. So they are in certain spaces together. So there's a very large group of African American women in that 1913 parade, for example, but they're treated really differently by the white organizers. So Alice Paul does not want them to march in the parade at all at first. They insist. Then she tries to say they can march in the back. They say, we're not going to do that. And ultimately they're in the parade where they choose. But it's because the question of voting rights for Black women opens up the Pandora's box of voting rights for Black men in the Jim Crow South, where they've been disenfranchised. And so white suffragists do not want that to come up. But in contrast that with the fact that they actually ask, Marie Bottineau Baldwin to have a float, So they're inviting her to participate. So that's a really different relationship. But so, yeah, I see suffragists sometimes in the same spaces, speaking at the same conferences, but I don't see them collaborating or allying. You do see that in the 1960s and 1970s with civil rights movements and social movements, but I didn't see much of it at the turn of the century.
Well, you've elicited a lot of interest in Baldwin and Bonnin, and people would like to know if there are any recordings of either of them, but also of Bonnin's opera or music.
That's a really good question. I don't know. I didn't run across any, but that's a great question about the opera. So her papers are at BYU, and she kind of collaborated with a professor at BYU about that opera at Brigham Young University. So it's possible that folks have done something. It played in New York in the 1930s. I think it was after she died. But I don't know. That's actually a great question. I'll have to try to find out.
I read in your, did you give the name of your book?
Yes.
Okay, so I read in Recasting the Vote where you said that Gertrude Bonnin spoke to the Improved Order of Red Men, and this was a fraternal patriotic society whose origins can be date back to the Sons of Liberty. Its members strongly, if entirely superficially, identified themselves with American Indians to the degree that they based their governance structure, their ceremonies, their modes of dress on that of American Indians. And of course, we would refer to these people as, quote, playing Indian. Still, in the early 20th century, the Improved Order of the Red Men counted presidents among their membership: Theodore Roosevelt, Warren Harding, Franklin D. Roosevelt. I can't help but wonder how they may have been dressed when Gertrude Bonnin spoke to them and how she dressed. One question, do we have any idea? And two, what would have Bonnin and Baldwin thought of groups that were playing Indian? I know that's a recent expression, but certainly they were aware of the Boy Scouts and all these sort of societies, like the Daughters of Pocahontas, where Anglo women dressed up like Indians.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I don't know. I just have a little snippet from the newspaper that she talked to them. I do know that she likely wore her outfit. She often did, and at that time, it was around 1918. And I suspect that she spoke to them about the patriotism and military participation of Native men in World War I, because that was also a major component of her speeches at the time. And she was really emphasizing that these Native men, many of whom didn't have US citizenship, were nonetheless fighting for the country, and thus Native men and women both deserved the right to vote. I don't know what she thought about that. I think she was very much willing to speak to anyone that she thought might be an ally, who might help her, again, kind of address the major issues that Native people were facing. This is often called the nadir of kind of Native history. There's just a great deal of poverty and health disease on the reservations, the boarding schools taking children away, right? She's looking for anyone who can help her. And, you mentioned the Boy Scouts, which was what was going through my mind. Her colleague in the Society of American Indians, Charles Eastman, was very willing to work with the Boy Scouts, and in fact, writes a book, a handbook to work with them. Again, what they were trying to do was really say Native cultures can be valuable and they shouldn't be erased. So anyone who seemed to appreciate that, I think they saw as a potential person to work with.
Thank you both, Cecile and Kathleen, so much. This has been so enlightening and very meaningful. I think that we all have a lot to think about this very rich history. So just want to thank you again. And I want to thank our guests for attending. And before we end, I would like to invite you to join us again on Tuesday, April 6th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Zoom for the Tommy L. Pegas and Donald A. Capocha Conversation Series in LGBTQ+ Portraiture, for a lecture entitled Fit for a Queen, Perkins Harnley, Victorian Style and Queer Identity in Mid-Century America, which will be presented by Dr. Sarah Burns, the Ruth N. Halls Professor Emerita of Art History at Indiana University. And I can promise you it is going to be a blast. So please join us again then. And so have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much again for attending. We're so thrilled to have you.